Hey, Melissa. Long time no see.
I know, Cliff. Now that we're having our private Zoom meetings, I expect to hear a lot more from you.
All right, I'll chat with you privately, babe.
I know. We're apparently being recorded, so you know we got to keep Cliff. We got to keep everything on the DL.
All right, all right.
I know.
You'll just have to come by in person sometime, catch up. I live at the office. I'm quarantined here. Yeah, true.
Well, I'm trying to stay COVID free, so you won't see me a lot.
You just set your priorities. That's fine. You know, you just be you.
I will, or I'll bring you like 2 masks.
There you go.
Cliff, I'm actually surprised you're here, although
What is that?
the only foundations meeting that I've logged on to. But and I'm here because I obviously taught in the first iteration, but not the second. So I thought the paper norming was important, but you've been teaching this all along, haven't you?
No, I think I last taught it in 2017. Yeah, I had a big string there going, but then last few years I haven't. So that's like riding a bike, you know.
Oh yeah, it is. Particularly with these 7-week mini terms, just like jump back.
I think we were all ready for a challenge. Yeah, you know, life was getting boring, predictable. So yeah, this is good.
Yeah, life in the spring was boring and predictable, that's for sure.
Yeah.
No, I was trying to figure out what the question was that you guys were talking about, Melissa and Cliff, and I guess it was why Cliff had to be here if he's been teaching this all along, and the answer is we make every single person do it every year. It's such a great joy that we want to share it every year as often as possible.
I'll be here.
What's that, Cliff?
I'm no scofflaw. I'll be here.
Well,
so you do realize, and I've emailed this to you individually about the step thing. When we were creating all of this before you came,
oh yeah,
Yana Brill was a huge detractor from the project, and not that Yana didn't want the kind of liberal arts, broad-based, great book skills thing, but she said, you know, eventually y'all will just be forced to be teaching the same exact class. And I have noticed, not that anyone here cares, but from the first iteration, which was definitely on a different topic, and we have some ways more freedom, but in some ways like a lot less. And part of that comes with the demand of assessment.
Yeah.
Right. So and I'm just talking about how forward-thinking Yana was to say that eventually, because we're going to have to assess all this, we will have much less. This will not be the kind of grand sort of ability of us to kind of teach these subjects, but a much kind of closer context. So I just want to remember Yana today. I miss her desperately.
She's still around. If you miss her desperately when the pandemic's over, you can visit. Don't make her sound dead. But so to your point about that, I couldn't figure out which side of the issue you were on the last time you emailed me about it, whether you were pro lockstep or pro freedom. I think I kind of thought you were pro lockstep, but it sounds now like you're pro freedom. I've always been logistically oriented. Which one are you? Tell me, freedom or lockstep?
Dude,
That's a very loaded terminology.
Well,
yeah.
okay.
So I really, here's the truth. I super appreciate like the rubrics and the intro videos and the like examples of assignments, and we have this sort of wealth of resources, and I love that. The lockstep thing probably comes more, I probably would feel much less like this if we were in a normal semester. But dang, trying to fill this in 7 weeks, and I mean fit it in a way that's meaningful. Can I push my students to get all this shit done and grade them on it? Sure I can. But in the past, you know, there's been some time for, not only on the part of the students, but for me to kind of think, and how does this tie into that? And why is this different? And we're on this sort of factory grind of this.
Yeah. Right.
And I think honestly, I mean, I would not want to teach this again in a 7-week format, but I would be happy to teach it again in a normal 16-week
So
semester.
I hope that you will. I agree that everything's really hard right now, and especially things that usually take some creativity and thought. Those are really, really hard to do right now. And so this class works best right now if you can, or any class works best right now if you can teach it on autopilot, right? I can teach Latin 101 fine right now because I can do it on autopilot. But this class, I currently do it on, I can do it on autopilot, but I'm not teaching it for the first time in a long time. You mentioned earlier about sort of broadening out some of their perspectives, and that's one reason that I hope that you will teach it again in a fall when we've got some more space, because I would love to hear from you in particular, you know, what 1 or 2 readings you think that we could add to the reader are that would add a more conservative perspective, I think was the way that you put it at the first point. About the lockstep thing, it's been sort of a natural evolution, just that some things have worked better than others, and some readings have worked better than others, and some assignments. And so just by trial and error, it happens, kind of natural selection-y. But that's never to say that you know, we couldn't add something more or revise something. So please do offer that stuff.
I think my concern about that was that, I mean, obviously we're all aware in the media, particularly media, that we faculty are charged with indoctrinating our students on a liberal bias. Mm-hmm. I don't actually believe that that's true. And I'm in the unfortunate position of actually teaching politics and reminding people that there are facts, which it's tough. Our students are young and more than 50% Republican. They're coming from places where telling them that seems like an opinion and indoctrination. I did this when I went through these readings. That there are no, like Edmund Burke's, there are no genuinely what we would consider helpful conservative theories or representations. And one of the reasons why this is so important is that it could give our students, right, a healthy understanding of, you know, what historically has been the conservative position and what is the administration doing now, because they don't know, right? And so
Melissa, you got some kind of max headroom thing going on with your audio there. Am I the only one hearing that?
Yeah, no, I'm hearing it too. I didn't know if it was
like
me.
Really wiggy. You're doing like, yeah, da 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 da.
Flanger effect.
I don't know if there's anything you can do about it.
Sorry. Yeah,
So-
my internet at home is. But anyway, I just thought that giving conservative students an actual grounding in real conservative ideology would be helpful in terms of their intellectual development, i.e., I hate to say this, I know it's being recorded and I could be fired for this, so that Donald Trump isn't a traditional.
Sections, please. I'm about 4 short, I think.
Bill, I'll have one for you. You probably know that already.
Yeah,
Loads
yeah, the
would
usual
not.
people will, but more
Yeah.
than the usual people is what's needed this time.
So let me hijack things and talk about norming. I do want to get us started so that we can make sure that we cover everything we need to. So we've got 3 papers. We've got 2 rubrics. I'm going to share my screen just to take you back to that that norming homepage so that I can walk through the 2 rubrics thing. So norming 2020, we grade, and in order that all of our grades be fair, every year we get together and we norm on the rubric that we use for grading, right? So that's one of the things that we have to do. The other thing is that we assess separately from the grading. I'm working on making that more efficient someday. And so the rubric that we use for that is this rubric developed by the AAC&U on critical thinking. And this is, we're the baseline for that. It's supposed to get assessed downstream from us. Currently, all the AOIs in a way assess critical thinking, but there's not a whole lot of critical thinking assessment outside of Foundations 111 and 112. We need to talk through each of these 3 papers. First one on Mencius, second one on Mencius, third one on Augustine. I tried to pick 2 Mencius papers because I know that it's hard to teach the class without doing Mencius, and I hate it when we have to talk about things that half the people haven't read. So I think probably most of you did Mencius and Sun Tzu. We'll work through those and talk about everybody's norming responses one by one. What we need to get to after that is I'll just remind you all about the self-assessment exercise, and then we'll talk for 15 minutes, I hope, about the final project. So I'm going to open up the Google Doc with its responses, and oh yeah, okay. We ought to be able to see what everybody said about Mencius. So here there's sort of a coalescence in the first paper. The first paper is the one that says paper number 1 in the heading. It starts out a question that has pondered minds of common people, philosophers, and some of the most influential people. It's called Essence and Substance. So I'm going to leave this up, but try and move more faces into here. Anybody want to volunteer some thoughts about this paper? Cliff, you can just talk. You don't need me to call on you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, mine were pretty well in line with the majority here. The first 2 I thought were a 3, reading and arguing. I gave a 2 to composing. I thought there was a lot of repetition, a lot of grammatical mistakes, things like that, that I didn't feel that ranked in proficient on my scale.
Perhaps not surprisingly, I tend to be a little harder on argument, but I thought it was a 2 at best on argument. The premises were very unclearly stated and only somewhat related to the conclusion. And I don't know if we're supposed to kind of defend the argument or just kind of state why we put it, but I just didn't think that the premises were very clear or very connected to the conclusion. So I did a 3-2-2.
3-2-2. I did a 2-3-2, and maybe it's good that we're talking about Mencius specifically about argument, because this is one where the stock question I find to be kind of challenging for students to do well on, because it leads them down. I should probably modify my own version if I don't like it, but I wind up getting students trying to talk about analogy as a way to argue, instead of talking broadly about the strength of his argument. And so I sort of nudge people's scores up a hair on arguing for Mencius, just because I find the assignment difficult for them. But I'm with Jonathan. I sort of gave this one a 2 on arguing. So he and I were the only ones that gave it a 2.
I also gave that one a 2 in arguing, because I felt like they didn't even address a counter argument.
Right.
I think I remember that too.
No, I would say 2 all the way through on that. I did not find any merit to move it up to a proficient.
In number 1, I wonder what's up with these. It looks like only 2 people gave it a 2 on arguing, and 7 people. Somebody want to make the case for a 3 or a 4 in something?
So I read the email where we're supposed to be relative to the what we would expect of freshmen.
Yeah.
Right. So that I think that's why I give it a 3, because I'm actually with Jonathan. I thought the argument was not very strong, but and noticed all the same faults that you have mentioned. But of course, I think nearly all freshmen that I've ever read are pretty terrible at arguing. And I teach logic, and so I see like a large sample size of poor grasp of argumentation, and so I thought it was pretty middling for a freshman at Georgetown College. It wasn't terrible. They did have some kind of evidence. They did have some kind of conclusion, and that seems to be about middle of the pack from my experience. So that's sort of a question for me, since this is my first time doing it, is to what extent are we measuring this against some sort of absolute measure? And to what extent are we measuring this against the other papers, or the what we would expect of other freshmen?
Yeah.
Can I add to that question real quick, John, that I think will be helpful? So it's just been a long time since I've done one of these norming things too. I've done it, but it's been a while. So how much do we, because I know the idea is fairness, but of course we all did pre-writing differently, and we all set expectations differently. So, for me in my class, this would probably be a 1. I actually bumped it to a 2, but in my class, I have been crystal clear with them about needing premises. They've turned in their premises. I've had to work with them and approve their premises. So if they had something this vague with no counter argument, then it would be fair to give them a 1, because I've given them a really clear rundown of what I'm looking for. So it's a genuine question.
Yeah.
How much are we norming to really grade the paper as if it went to just anybody? And how much can we take into account the expectations we've set with them over the past several weeks?
So the answer to both of those questions is yes. So we have a rubric that lays out in concrete terms what our expectations are for things. So for example, on the argument piece, so for 4, right, thesis states relevant and interesting thesis. Thesis may exhibit nuance and original thought. Soundness, support. Each paragraph support contains relevant and convincing support for its own idea. Counter arguments, possible objections to the student's arguments are serious, described accurately and fairly, and evaluated convincingly with an intellectual honesty. The best thing that we can do at each one of these norming meetings is get ourselves each on track with what the instrument says, because we're all trying to apply this instrument as if it is a concrete and objective standard. That said, we all have to respond to our individual expectations, and and do it in a way that's fair to the other classes. So I think that's not a question either to Dan or Jonathan that I can give you an absolute answer for. The goal of norming is for us all to sort of hear each other out and kind of coalesce around an understanding of the way that we're applying this. Why don't we work towards that by talking about reading or composing too, so that we've got some more data on the table, because I want to move us into the critical thinking rubric as well. So for reading, for example, it looks like we have 2 people gave it a 4, 7 gave it a 3, and 2 people gave it a 2. No ones. I think that's right. Somebody want to make the case for one of these?
I can say about the reading, I think I was really simplistic here. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, my assessment was, okay, does this student show that he or she understand the reading at least, mm-hmm. right? Yeah. And sort of cover the reading. And I think that the argument here was problematic in this essay. I think that the way the premises and so there were other issues, but I had the feeling that, you know, the students actually understood the reading itself, right? So that's why I ended up, and especially, and I was actually going to give you a 3. I think a 4 was an inflation there, but I think that it's more of a 3 here. But that was my feeling. So reading, my assessment was, okay, does it show that the student understood the reading? With some level of finesse, right?
Yeah.
With some level of depth.
Mm-hmm.
And that, to me, I think that the student got it in this.
And that's, I think that's a good way of putting it. Does the student understand the reading with some finesse? My score on reading was a little bit low. I think I gave it a 2 because I was fixated on some of their misunderstandings of the individual analogies. I thought that he misunderstood the analogy about hacking willow wood to make a cup or a bowl.
Yes, yes, exactly. And actually, I was going to ask you that because, okay, am I wrong here? Because to me, it felt like completely wrong understanding about that. You are right there.
But
there's kind of a gray area there in terms of, you know, where is the line between understanding of the reading and use of that reading as evidence for argument?
Yes. So the answer to that is, let's look at the rubric. The rubric for proficiency says for 3, identifies and explores an adequate range of significant passages with some relevance to his own argument. I think that the range of passages here was adequate. That's good. Demonstrates a good grasp / sufficient understanding of the main ideas and arguments of selected passages. So if the choice is between good or rudimentary, which is a 2, probably this guy does have a good understanding of it, but it's not excellent. So I might have been wrong with my 2. Some thought in providing meanings, explanations of key ideas. Few exceptions, uses structural cues correctly to aid in interpretation. I thought that one exception to that was in the paragraph on page 4, he had a sort of haphazard deployment of examples. He started with a quote from page 128 and followed it with a quote from page 125 and 6. So that's an exception to using structural cues correctly. Interprets most passages carefully and with attention to context. So that's the description of a 3. I probably have to grant that he's closer to that than a 2, where it describes it as rudimentary.
John, I think with me, I've always found the reading category to be kind of the ugly stepsister that's very hard to nail down this way. I mean, as the others are fairly clear to assess. Sorry, was that wrong? So I saw some of the problems that you might have put with reading as composing issues. They're more writing issues. Did they get a grasp of what they're talking about, but they just didn't express it well. They wrote it poorly.
Yeah. And that's fair, and that's one of those things that I think is usually going to come out in the wash in terms of how we differently grade. That you might ding them for something on reading, and I might ding them for the same thing in arguing, or the other way around. But it does usually turn out after these norming sessions that we're all pretty close in our overall assessments.
And that's a good point, John, that there is a case to be made for trying not to ding them twice, which I struggle with writing and arguing, for example.
Mm-hmm.
If they've got bad writing, there's always a bad argument. If they've got bad arguing, it's always screwing up their writing.
Yeah.
So I try to just ding them on the one that I think is worse rather than ding them twice, because otherwise a poorly written paper ends up failing on everything, because they're sure not showing a good reading if they wrote poorly, and they're sure not showing a good argument if they wrote poorly.
And to piggyback on that point, the converse of it is I tend to carry sort of half points on the grading rubric and then figure out, which of these is least bad or whatever. Like on this one, I would say it's got a clear structure. Okay, is that structure of the argument? Is that structure of the writing? Well, the writing's pretty crappy, so I would put that half over towards the argument part and end up with like a 3 on that and a 2 on writing. But the structure of the piece could go either way. It's just something that needs to go in one, but not both.
Yep. Yep. So anybody want to say something about the crappy writing, Bill?
Not the crappiest I've seen.
It's not the worst, no.
No, but it's
more just serval analogies. Okay, serval is a kind of cat. Like, as a biologist, I would love to see serval analogies, particularly because Mencius talks about nature, but A, they're not from Asia, and B, Mencius doesn't talk about them. So no, I don't think serval analogies, fit here. Just looking at the very beginning of it.
So the thing that struck me about the writing was that his discussion of individual topics sort of strayed from one paragraph into another paragraph, so that I didn't see the kind of unity of paragraphing that I care about a lot. Anybody else want to comment on the writing?
Something I noticed that it's hard to help students do this is it's hard to help them choose really precise words and not be wordy. So I think that a lot of college students feel like freshmen feel like they need to write at a college level, and for some reason they interpret that as being overly complicated or overly wordy. So anyhow, that's what I noticed, and it's a hard habit to help them write.
I like to cite Socrates and Wollstonecraft on that point. We're going to speak plainly and simply, and that's part of what makes us persuasive. I mean, I'll write that in their comments, and it maybe helps a little bit.
Hey, John, I've got a couple quick questions.
Yeah, shoot.
One, are we not to give in-between scores when we're actually grading?
So the answer to that on the rubric, as we'll look, you can give 2.5 for the grading rubric, but not for the assessment rubric. The assessment rubric, we're going to have to deal with whole numbers.
Because where would this one land? Let's say it got a 332, so that's an 8. Where would that land in terms of a grade?
332, 8 points gives you a B. It's on the lower side of a B.
Okay, and that sounds about right to me. I'd say BC kind of range for this.
Yeah.
BC, yeah. Okay. Sometimes I feel like the rubric pushes grades down from what I might normally assign.
It might. No, I'm not sure. I just want to mention one thing, and I don't know what to do with it. Carrie, maybe add your thoughts on this. Usually students that are taking this class are taking English 111 or 112 at the same time, and that's not true this term. And we usually have the benefit of knowing that they're getting writing instruction somewhere else. And this year, students who are going to take writing instruction at Georgetown will not have had any before this class. Carrie?
That's true. However, we have quite a few students who happen to be in English 111 right now. I don't know how that happened, but we do. I actually, I thought it was supposed to be like dual credit students and other people, but it's happened. Even one student who really should not be in a double, according to like an A student who's in both of them at the same time.
Oh, well.
I know. I don't know how that happened, but I mean, that's led to a drop in foundations. So. Like I know that contributed to a student needing to drop foundations.
Yeah.
So that is kind of an admin thing, but yeah, you're right. This time they don't have any any additional support for writing. So I've just been very clear with my students. It's kind of like saying, I'm introducing this to you now. You will learn it again. But yeah, I go with the assumption that they don't have that background.
I find that very impressive because this group of students is the best writing overall I've seen in several years. So that's, wow.
May I make one quick remark about these essays here that to me pose always an extra problem, which is this essay here and some others like this one asks about how convincing the argument was. To me, the way I interpret this is it's not about necessarily what he said, but how he said, right? And that's the case with Sun Tzu as well, right? So one analogy is to say, okay, he's making the argument here that ice cream is the best food ever. Was he convincing? So if the question is how convincing it is, it's about, you know, or his analogy is well structured? Is he using proper sources? Is he backing up his argument with illustrations? It's more about how he said things rather than what he said things. And one problem that we often have here is that students are attracted to answer some of these essays because they have a personal conviction on the answer here. Like, yeah, I agree with him or I don't agree with him. And they focus on the what issue, right? Not explaining where are the strengths and weaknesses of the arguments that makes those. You might go in and say, no, I believe that man is evil. And you might come out of his lecture and say, man, he got me, you know, because he was good, he was convincing. So that to me is one added layer of complexity for these essays. And I try to warn my students again and again about it, and they keep falling for this. And I find myself sort of taking some points there because they really did not. They were just advocating for the argument, this evil or good, without really telling us, okay, but how good or how weak he was in making those statements.
Yeah, and I think that for you to take some points off there is good and appropriate. Let's talk about the critical thinking value rubric because it's the one that we have the most trouble doing well. This is, to repeat what I try and say as often as possible, this is the one that is keyed to performance as a college student broadly, not specifically to Foundations 111. That's the most important thing that we take away from this half of the norming, that we are not using the critical thinking. 4 on critical thinking is not this kid's got an A in Foundations 111. 4 on critical thinking is probably closer to this kid's got an A in Poli-Sci 350 or something like that. Some middle of the road, you know, lower upper 300 level class. Right?
Hey, John.
Yeah.
Could just real quick, could all of the bar graphs are not showing. It doesn't show the last couple of categories on there with the screen share.
There we
go. Yeah, is there a way of shrinking it so that fits or something?
I don't know, because it's not the whole screen.
Yeah.
So I'll scroll sideways as we're talking about
it,
but I don't think that I can fix it. The names of these are not particularly helpful either, but 4 is good, 1 is bad. Benchmark is 1. 2 and 3 are both milestones, so they're waypoints along the way. 4 is, you know, this is a good job for a college student. And again, they're described in as much concrete as you can do for a rubric that's meant to be applicable to every discipline. So to look at explanation of issues, 4 says issue to be considered is critically stated and described comprehensively, delivering all relevant information necessary for full understanding. It's a high bar, right? 3 says issue to be considered critically is stated, described, and clarified so that understanding is not seriously impeded by omissions. Okay, I think that's something that a good Foundations 111 kid can do. 2 says it's considered critically and is stated, no, it is stated, but description leaves some terms undefined, ambiguities unexplored, boundaries undetermined, backgrounds unknown. That sounds really familiar to me for this class. And 1, it's stated without clarification or description. And I think that we've many of us seen versions of that in this class too. I find that in my grading, the range that I'm willing to assign from this rubric is really only in the 1 to 3 range. It's pretty rare that I find a Foundations 111 student that gets a 4 on anything on this rubric, for me. So let's talk through this, because I want to make sure that we spend a little bit of time on each one of these categories. Explanation of issues, it looks like more people gave it a 3 than a 2, and we only got 1 very low. So we're already starting near the same place. I think I gave this guy a 3 on explanation of issues, even though I gave him a 2 on everything else. I thought that his introduction was maybe the strongest part of his paper. He laid out in the introduction not just a little bit of the intellectual context, but he also went to a surprising degree into exploring the other side. He talks about how Minch's analogies leave many obvious questions unanswered, and he spends 4 lines on that as part of the introduction. That I thought that gave the introduction, you know, a surprising amount of subtlety for as kind of sloppy as much of the rest of the paper was. Other thoughts on explanation of issues here?
I think I gave it a 2 because he didn't really talk about Gauzy. I should say he or she, whoever it was, didn't seem to understand Gauzy, and maybe that's just something they failed to put in their paper because they thought Dr. Hinkle knows, so I don't have to explain it. But that was a problem for me.
I agree that that's a problem, and especially in the first paragraph, he messed up the context of one of the analogies by screwing that up. Other thoughts here?
Yeah, I'm on the 2 side too.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I actually didn't like, I was going to ask who the professor was for these 2 papers, but I thought that they structured the essays more based on looking at analogies than an argument. So I think they kind of pick what they're talking about by sorting through what are the best analogies. And so on that level, I think they did a good job. But I think that didn't actually make for good papers. And this is where the difference in who's teaching the class makes a big difference, because I don't think, for me, them being able to point out which analogies are good or bad doesn't make a good argument for me. So that was some of the reasons why I took a lot of points off both of these.
I think that's fair. One thing that I'll try and say a couple times is that whenever you've got, you know, when you're not sure about how to grade something, just recur back to the words on the page on the rubric. So for here, 3 and 2 are what we're talking about, right? So 3 says, issue to be considered critically is stated, described, and clarified so that understanding is not seriously impeded by omissions. So we're talking about how they lay out the question, and there's not much missing from that. 2 says it is stated, but description leaves some terms undefined, ambiguities unexplored, boundaries undetermined, and or backgrounds unknown. So there's a lot of kind of vague categories there. You could ding him with Joanna on backgrounds unknown, right? Saying that Gauzy and the Confucianist background is actually really important for this, and that's definitely fair. I think I skewed high on this because I was thinking in terms of possible disagreements, and I thought that he showed subtlety there, but mostly it sounds like we're basically in accord here on explanation of issues, even if we're disagreeing whether we fall on the 3 or the 2 side. Evidence says this is about selecting and using information to investigate a point of view or conclusion, right? So the examples they use in their paragraphs. And we've got equal numbers of 3s or 2s. Somebody want to make a case for one of those?
I can say that sort of, I think that there was that glaring issue of one analogy about the bows, and I think that was problematic.
Yeah.
But I had the feeling that the students sort of covered sort of several passages from the reading. And I had the feeling that the student perhaps is a pre-law student, you know, those them lawyer people, they sort of come up and they write, they're not really saying anything meaningful, but they say it somehow with some complexity. We feel like, okay, maybe he's saying something here, right? So I was actually on the fence, and I was between 2 and 3. I gave a 3 because I feel that I usually tend to be a little bit too harsh. So here I decided to go for a 3 just to compensate that a little bit. But I could make the case here either way, 2 or 3.
So for me, this this one breaks down to what it says in the description about having enough interpretation / evaluation to develop a coherent analysis or synthesis. I probably leaned with Guy about straddling the fence. I thought that the one analogy was badly mishandled, but that most of the other ones seemed like they were well understood.
Yeah.
Mostly.
So for what it's worth, I went for the 2, partly because I didn't feel like they had brought it together into anything coherent. So I'm with you in terms of I can see it either way. I'm not going to make a strong case here, but I felt like evidence was taken piecemeal here, there, or anywhere and just kind of thrown into the paper and not made into a single coherent argument. So that's why I went for 2.
That's fair.
I went for a 3 on this one, just because even though I did notice the bowl metaphor being mishandled, I thought that the student actually rallied quite a bit of evidence to prove his or her point. And I was impressed with that, because I notice frequently when students are writing, they will bring in maybe just one point to try to prove something and explain it in a somewhat shallow manner. So it struck me when I was reading that the student actually had a lot of evidence and generally understood what he or she was saying and was trying to connect it to the point. It just occasionally, he just misunderstood what he was talking about. So that's why I gave it a 3.
Maybe let's talk about the next category, which is influence of context and assumptions. This one's tough because context and assumptions aren't exactly the same thing, and it's not clear that it means the same thing in different disciplines. So we've got a pretty wide spread here, more people around 2, but some people up at the 4 side and more people down on the 1 side. Anybody want to make a case for their understanding of this and what they gave it?
I really struggled to apply this one to a foundations paper because we don't require research and context and stuff.
Yeah.
I guess just thinking of it holistically and objectively, as opposed to, making allowances for the student, I felt like they were showing an emerging awareness of assumptions, not any deep depth of it. They didn't question any of their assumptions. They kind of just threw them out there. There was no real counter argument. So I want to at least look for a good counter argument before I'm going to say they're questioning their assumptions. I didn't quite know how to apply it, but I'm just telling you the lines I kind of drew to decide how to do this one. So I gave it a 1.
I go back and forth on this one because when I see assumptions, I think about a counter argument, and like you say, I didn't see one at all. The other side of it, though, is about context, and that one's a little bit clearer about how we would apply it here. On context, again, I thought that with Joanna, the intellectual context was a little bit anemic, and especially the specific relationship to Gaozi is important to this one and was missing. The way that the descriptions are written, it's only Capstone and Benchmark that mention context. The other ones emphasize assumptions. It may be that it's better for us to understand context as part of each of these descriptions a little bit more. that at least that's the way that I've landed when I struggle on how to apply this one.
I think there's a difference in approach too when we look at the context part between sections. I mean, where some of us emphasize more outside references and such for context, and some of us treat it more as just, I mean, I treat it like sort of a microcosm. You know, we're going to look for evidence in this reader here and learn to do that before we branch out too much into other sources. But I know other people take a different approach. And so it makes context really hard to evaluate outside of what's the context of other things we've read that I know you've read for this course, or that's actually in that reading.
I guess that's fair, but I think that's a place where you have adequately communicated your expectations to your students. And so if they're doing context well by you, then I think that's a more or less objective assessment of their ability to do well the thing that you're teaching them. So I don't worry. I would only worry if we were grading other people's papers, I think.
Fair enough.
How about position? I got a lot of 2s here. 2 4s, 2 1s, 7 2s. So we've got a lot of agreement here. Position is perspective, thesis, hypothesis. So the student's thesis fits here. I'll say that I probably use this also as a way to look at the way that they develop their argument as they go through, not just the way that they lay it out in the introductory paragraph. I gave this guy a 2, even though I thought that the introductory paragraph had some nuance. I thought that the paragraphs didn't add up to a very coherent take on the argument.
I may have used this one to punish them for the lack of counter arguments. I can't remember. It was this or the previous one, but one of them
Different sides.
I interpreted that same way.
And
Yeah.
I may have overdinged them, but I gave him a 1 because of no counter argument. I mean, it says, you know, to get a 2, they're supposed to acknowledge different sides of an issue. That's,
yeah,
for what it's worth. I really dinged him on that, I guess.
And I'm not as mean as Jonathan, so I gave him a 2 for the same reason. So.
Can we have a vote on who's meaner, me or Cliff? Could we vote on that?
I want to include Melissa on that. Sorry, Melissa.
Well, let's talk about conclusions, and then we'll move on to the next paper. Conclusions and related outcomes. So this is maybe the graph is giving us the finger. I don't know what this is, but we've got a kind of even spread. More people on 2, but a lot of people on not 2 here. Somebody make a case.
Didn't they relate the conclusion back to the thesis? I can't remember this one. I mean,
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah. Here's what conclusion says for 3 and 2. Conclusion 3 says conclusion is logically tied to a range of information, including opposing viewpoints. Related outcomes are identified clearly. 2 says it's logically tied to information because information is chosen to fit the desired conclusion. Some related outcomes are identified clearly. I think of 2 as as more or less in my head correlating to the kind of conclusion that just relists the points that they've made.
Yeah.
That I have argued X, Y, and Z. The intro says I will argue X, Y, and Z. They argue that, and then the conclusion says I have argued X, Y, and Z. It's capable, but nothing impressive. Sort of mechanically acceptable.
So I think this is a case for me, and just in interest of norming, I'll throw this out there. I don't see how anyone could do very well on this marker in the way that I've set up the paper. Not saying because of them, because I did not push them to consider other implications of their conclusion.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to rank anyone very high on this because I didn't tell them to do it in the first place.
Yep.
But if I'm supposed to be kind of taking it objectively, that is something that a good paper would do typically. So my understanding is that we're just to look at this kind of holistically. If this was any college paper, how would we see it? And there, you know, kind of a 2, maybe to a 3, but really kind of a 2 is as high as I could see going because of that second part of it. But tell me if I'm thinking about wrong.
No, I don't think you're wrong. And especially because the way that we should be using assessment is to figure out how we should change our class if we, you know, if we want to do better at this, right? So we've got to stick to the standards. And I think it's fine to say that the way that we teach this class does not encourage people to look far outside the assignment in terms of drawing conclusions. Well, with that fuck you from the graph there, let's move on to paper number 2, which is also about Mencius. And I think I had a different take on this one. It looks like most of us had a pretty different take on this one. Reading almost all 4, couple 3, arguing more or less split between 4 and 3, and likewise composing split between 4 and 3. Maybe we'll talk about reading first. I thought that the points were did an excellent job of covering all bases. I thought that they were explained clearly, and I didn't notice, except for one slight misunderstanding that leapt out at me. The 4 rating on reading says variety of significant passages. I thought that was true. Excellent grasp or understanding of the main ideas. I thought that was true. And evidence effectively supports the students' understanding of all the main ideas. So we all seem to agree about that. Arguing, we're split between a 4 and a 3. I gave it straight 4s. Somebody other than me wanna talk about the arguing?
One thing I just struggle with on these is it does a really good job of just following the guidelines, bam, 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 and I really encourage them to, I mean, I think of that as being kind of the baseline for a decent one, and it checks the boxes, but I also emphasize in the different readings, you know, how they're tailoring their arguments or being persuasive in different ways, and so I encourage them to do things like, for example, put the counter argument first, like Darwin does, or, you know, you don't have to have 3 of this and 1 of that, and it kind of biases me against it if it is just does a great job following a formula, which this one seems to do. I don't know I'd be curious how other people feel about that. Is that something that we're trying to encourage, or are we trying to get good formulaic essays at this point and work beyond that later?
I'll say that I like people to master the formula before I let them move on past the paint by numbers step.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's where I am.
I mean, I agree. Yeah, I'm happy if I get a bunch of papers that follow the formula.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, you get a Picasso, and that's great, and I reward them for that. You know?
Yeah. Anybody else want to weigh in on the arguing, whether it was a 4 or a 3?
Like, just people who can capitalize, just generally. Chinese history. I mean, I'm with whoever said this is very formulaic, and they hit all the boxes. My assumption is this is a student who could have really perhaps excelled. I also didn't necessarily think that the connection between Confucius and the reading that we're reading in the introduction is not clear. because we're not reading Confucius. And the whole entire introduction is on Confucius. So I had a problem when it's just down towards the end of the first paragraph where our actual reading is brought up.
Actually, I liked that aspect, Melissa, because it provided a lot of context. These are both Confucian scholars, both Mencius and Sun Tzu, and interpreting him very differently. So
I
That
think
probably did.
one simple sentence,
yeah,
making that connection, because all of a sudden, you know, almost second to last sentence, reading about Confucius, and then here's this other dude. That to me does not make a good context opening paragraph.
I think this depends on the emphasis of the section too. You know, whether it's microcosm, what's in the reader, or whether it pulls in a fair amount of external context.
I can tell you that this section required this student to watch like a 30-minute video on Confucius before we started this. So that's probably part of what went into his introduction.
In which case, I would consider it good to tie in that context because it was something that they were expected to.
I'm going to have the same kind of thing. Students like to do content. You know, we talk about the importance of context and understanding. And so you'll get that in some of my introductions.
yes.
I use Carrie's kind of pie structure a lot, and I dinged this student a little bit for not having sufficient explanation. I thought there was a lot of illustration, but very little explanation of how that actually supported the thesis. So just making a quick case for going down towards
I think that's sharp. That's true. I felt that, but wasn't able to put my finger on that. Can I ask you guys about writing, and then we'll talk about applying the value rubric here. We were a little bit split on writing. 4-3-2 here.
Sorry, John. Just before we move on, because I think I was one of the people who actually gave a 2 for arguing here.
Oh, okay.
And I think that the reason I did it is, I think it, once again, is tied up to that issue of students not really fully reading the question and understanding what's being asked of them. I felt that this essay, oftentimes it was highly descriptive. It didn't provide a good description of what the argument is, but there was no analytical point being made. Right? That's how I felt in several passages here. I think that he or she followed the format, right? That's all the key elements there, presented all 3 premises, counter argument. But I felt that oftentimes it felt to me too descriptive, not really raising the analytical issue of how saying what he said was convincing or not.
So I think that's more true of the first and third body paragraphs, or of the second body paragraph than the first and third. I thought the first and third, he did an all right job of saying why the analogies that he was talking about in those were effective. The first one saying that he was able sort of deftly to use people's analogies back at them, and the third one talking about how Ox Mountain is a counter argument. I think you're right about the second one, the seed analogy, where he just describes the use of the seed analogy without saying why seeds are a particularly effective analogy.
Yeah. Anyway, that was my take then.
Thoughts on the writing?
I do have a problem with the conclusion. Now, again, I'm not a native speaker of English, and I never write a paper in English myself. Okay, so if I'm wrong, please let me know. So the conclusion for me, I mean, it's not clearly stated. The student also starts the last paragraph by saying, other arguments about the true nature of mankind existed during the period of warring states among those who studied other Confucius. For me, I always tell my students, if you're not going to explain it, don't say it. So if that is going to be your conclusion, why do you say that at the beginning of the paragraph? Because it makes no sense to me.
And he does talk about his context for the conclusion is Mencius versus other competitors, and he hasn't talked about other competitors in very great detail at all. That's fair.
I did think this was quite a bit better than the first essay, obviously in terms of grammar, writing style, that sort of thing. But I don't disagree with what you're saying, Abraham. I think I gave him a 3 on this. He or she.
For me, the difference between a 4 and a 3 in writing is easiest to tell. Where is the style part? Yeah, down at the bottom in sentences. Overall prose style may be scintillating and memorable is the way that we describe writing in a 4
Memorably
paper.
good.
And for 3, it's clear but workmanlike. And that's not the only thing that goes into the writing score, obviously, but I think I find style predictive, and that if something's going to be a 4, it's usually well styled as well as the other stuff. That said, I guess I gave this a 4, but I'm not sure that I would have said that it was scintillating.
Yeah, that's tough. I don't know how many books I read I'd call scintillating. I mean, come on.
That's definitely not. Well,
Sorry,
I don't know.
John.
Yeah.
Say that you put the writing on this at a 4.
I did. I think probably relative to other things, but I also said that in the context of saying maybe I was wrong. What do you give it, Melissa?
Okay. I was between 2 and a 3. So I was just when we're doing the norming thing, I'm really trying to embrace where everybody else is at. But in terms of writing, even for a freshman, did you really give this paper a 4?
So stop with the ad hominem and tell me why you gave it the thing that you gave it.
Because he/she can't capitalize and doesn't know that proper nouns should be capitalized. There's terrible sentence structure throughout. Basic grammar writing, I think, is problematic. Can you not read this and just go through sentence by sentence and be like, yeah, there's no comma here?
Not compared to the first one, it's much better though.
It's much better
Yeah.
than the first one.
I think I may have lower
So
standards
that
for freshmen.
first one is C. I'd give it a C.
So
I'm a B.
But
I don't know out of freshmen how we think that this is like in terms of writing, just writing, how we would give this a 4, which is the top of an A. So instead of sending it, so let me hear why you think this deserves the absolute best score in writing from a freshman paper.
So this is the way that I tend to think about writing in this class. Because I don't have time to teach mechanics, I don't concentrate as much on mechanics when I grade for writing as I do on things like paragraphing and organization. And that's just sort of the way that I think about my role in this class versus Carrie's role in English 111. So the parts of the writing rubric are intro, conclusion, organization and flow, paragraphs, and sentences. What you're saying, I think, falls under the first part of the sentences rubric, where it says strong writing basics, good writing basics, versus errors in grammar, sentence structure, etc. And at least the way that the rubric is constructed, there's a lot of room, in my view, for minimizing things like mechanical errors if it's in the context of strong organization, unified paragraphs, etc. Those things that, at least for me, I feel like I'm more able to teach.
Okay, I agree. But I'm hoping our English add in here that the writing is part of the argumentation. And so when you look at the beginnings of, it says a sentence starts by starting this, comma, similarly, comma. I mean, it's the language, the writing, the situation. It actually detracts here in this case from the argument. I mean, I'm sorry. I think the writing here, I mean, is a B at best, and to give it an excellent score, it's the writing detracts for me from the argument. And that's when I deduct for writing, is when it detracts from the argument.
Can I get somebody other than me to chime in here on what they thought about the writing?
Can I, one thing that I noticed on, or Carrie.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, really, go ahead.
Like looking at the conclusion,
maybe Carrie, you get your chance after all.
It misstates the thesis because they phrase it as, for Mencius, that Mencius is the most persuasive argument. He phrases it in terms of he was considered as, his argument was more convincing than others presented during this era, created the prevailing idea. It's like the thesis isn't actually stated because they're not direct about it. And I feel like that's one of the most common things I go over with them, which I don't think is really detailed writing mechanics, is just be direct, say what you mean to say, make this about Mencius's argument, and they don't do that. I mean, I would call this one a 3 overall because but I wouldn't call it a 4 because that's just being direct and saying what you mean to say is pretty fundamental, I think.
Carrie, what were you going to say?
I wasn't going to actually talk about the specific assignment right there. I was just going to talk about this idea of writing, and we use the word mastery, which I think is problematic. And we've talked about this before, like whether or not we should use this mastery. But when I hear Melissa say, you know, is this the top of the freshman? I mean, I get that. And when I look at the word mastery, that's what I'm looking at. So I completely get where she's coming from. However, when I read this, I don't look at this as top of the freshman ability. You know, I look at it as, have they really hit the mark as a first semester student in foundations? And so I think the word mastery is problematic. And I know we've talked about this before, you know, this idea that it has to be essentially almost perfect. So to me, I don't think I gave this a 4. I may have, I don't remember my mark. I didn't write them down. I was in a hurry and I apologize for that. But I did not mind the writing so much in this. I thought it was actually pretty good control of sentence structure. Maybe some of the stylistic, you know, commas after everything was problematic, but I mean, they're not, some of them were used correctly. So I think I recall being kind of impressed about the command of sentence structure, maybe not the perfection of it, but there was some command of sentence structure in this. But I think the mastery thing, when we're doing norming, especially when we're returning to the class after a while or, you know, new, is a little bit misleading because I do not expect mastery of writing for a student to be able to get an A on their TDE, because otherwise nobody's going to get an A on a TDE. And that's just, you know, I don't think that's what we're going for.
So why don't we go ahead, Lisa?
Oh, I was just going to say, again, this is because we can't do the little bits. So where I wouldn't give it a 4, I might give it, you know, 3.25 or something like that, if that helps Melissa, because I agree. To me, it doesn't feel like mastery. I couldn't give it a 4, but I could give it like a 3.25 or.
Exactly. Like I wouldn't give it 100%.
Right.
You know?
But we didn't have that choice.
Give it a B because I couldn't give it 100%. So it's kind of this arbitrary.
Right.
Where I was at, which is a 3. I was only countering John's, because I want to understand that he would give this a 4. And and he said, does anyone want to dispute my 4? So I let in.
Oh no, that's
No,
good.
you did the
The
right
point,
thing. I mean,
that's just right.
My paper, I gave it a B. I thought this was a B paper. And I thought the writing was a B as well. Although, if you have every single sentence almost in your paper that has commas, I'm sorry, I just have an issue with that.
All right, so
I think one thing too is that we do emphasize different things when we go over the drafts with them. And when I'm looking at this, I'm seeing just a couple of things that I would definitely have expected them to change when revising that draft, such as state your thesis accurately, you know, but rather make it about Mencius's argument, which they don't do, that I would just immediately, they didn't fix that. And
when it comes to norming, we can be one off, you know, I mean, when we have a widespread, that's really where the discussion is. But with, you know, somebody gives it a 3, somebody gives it a 4, that's no big deal. Somebody gives it a 1, somebody gives it a 4, that's what we're talking about. But 3s and 4s, 2s and 3s, when it comes into how you teach your class and what you emphasize and what you focus on in the revision and the draft stage, we all have our focus. And that's one of the great things about this class. Students going to come out of this class having grown in some way. They don't have to have every single one of us to tell them, you know, you know, so to me, as long as we are close, that's okay.
Thank you for that. Let's move on to the value rubric and talk about that briefly. We're not going to be able to talk about paper number 3 because I still want to talk about the final project. So for the value rubric here, it looks like most people gave it a 3 on a lot of things. I'm looking at my grades. I probably gave it a 3, 3, 2, 3, 3. I thought that context and assumptions was a little bit weaker than the other ones. Let's do this. Is there any particular category from the value rubric that you guys are confused about, that you think merits particular conversation? Because I don't want to get mired down trying to spend 20 minutes on this after we already did it with another paper and run out of time for something else. Carrie?
I think you did a good thing at the beginning when you just clarified to all of us again that the value rubric is a gen ed thing and it's over the span of 4 years. So really a capstone is really what we're looking for in senior seminar, you know? So I think if we can just have that reminder and that, you know, benchmark is kind of brand spanking new freshman. And so I think that helps clarify. I hope I answered your question or got to, but I think that's the biggest thing to remember is when you're coming into this, how different the value rubric is to the class rubric. They're really almost night and day. So a 4 on the class rubric is not a 4 on the value rubric in no way, shape, or form. It might be a solid milestone 1, maybe a milestone 2, you know, but again, I think that helps us to remember they're just incredibly different rubrics.
I've almost never given 4s on the value rubric.
But I could see why somebody would if we are looking at it like that context of freshmen, but it's the context of a 4-year program.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cliff, what were you going to say?
Oh, nothing. I mean, this is just for assessment, so nobody will ever look at it, of course, too.
Nobody will ever look at this except for me 5 years from now when I have to write another 100-page report about it.
Yeah, I look at some of these.
Yeah.
I will say one thing that would help that I wanted to mention in the norming, that what we find when we look at these rubrics is most of the grading seems to be sort of overall quality, and it makes it hard to distinguish like where are the strengths and weaknesses in the class. So I think for usefulness in grading, it might be good to lean a little towards, you know, bump up the best part, bump down the worst part, just so we can differentiate. And it doesn't look like, if it's 2s across the board, then what do we work on to improve the course?
Yeah,
and that's what we're seeing when we look at the data.
Bill's Foundations 112 report had an interesting suggestion for how we might approach this in the future, and that's just in terms of like ranking the quality, to ranking the categories from high to low, just so that you know, and that's the way that he looked at the scores, was inside an individual class. What was that teacher's students performing especially well on and especially poorly on? So,
because otherwise the overall assessments for those students completely wash out any differentiation between those categories.
yeah. Any other comments, thoughts on the value rubric here? Questions? Okay, then in that case, I'm going to cut the Augustine paper because we don't have time for it, and I want to go on to talking about what comes after this. So we would usually in our semester be doing a TDE halfway through the semester, and then another one 2/3 of the way through the semester, but now we've only got one. And so as a consequence, what's going to come after this is a little bit different from normal. Let me go back to home. We'll only have one self-assessment exercise this term, and your job is to give it out after you give, or when you give your feedback on the paper. So self-assessment exercise number 1, it's down here at the bottom. Let me pop into it. What it does is it sort of generalizes the approach that we've always taken to self-assessment. It asks students to assess themselves on annotating, reading for structure, reading to interpret, reading with context, reading to interpret, reading to engage. So those are the reading skills. Then on composing, and then on arguing. And it asks them to write an explanation of each one. The difference between a good self-assessment and a bad self-assessment is the explanation. I get routinely, and we have to work against this, people that just write one sentence, tiny short explanations. What we're asking them to do is to be thoughtful about evaluating their own performance in the class. And so up here at the top, the example gives a short paragraph here. Please encourage your students to take that to heart and to write thoughtful little blurbs here for each one, instead of just an explanation that says, I gave it a 4 because I did kind of okay, right? We get a lot of that otherwise.
Does it have to be done in class, or they do this?
No, it doesn't have to be done in class. You can do it in class if you want to. I usually give this as a written homework for them to do it at home. The idea is that you should give it to them, though, with your feedback on their paper, because you're asking them also to read and respond to your feedback. So the second thing it asks is for them to think about what concrete steps they'll take to keep improving on these skills, including when they get outside of this class. The most obvious place to sort of think about is what they can do in Foundations 112, but this is our chance to connect what we do in this class with the skills that they're going to use in all their classes. So as you're talking about that, draw their attention to the future horizon. The last part is the essay self-assessment, where we make sure that they read our feedback on their essay. So look at the rubric scores your instructor gave you and whatever feedback. Do you agree with them? Why or why not? What strengths do you recognize in your writing? What concrete steps will you take to continue improving? What's the most significant part of your writing that needs work? What steps can you take in the future to improve on that? So this last part asks them to write a detailed paragraph in response to these 3 things. If they write 3 paragraphs for you, all the better. The goal here is just to get them thinking about the skills component of Foundations 111 in a more serious way than they might do otherwise. Any questions on the self-assessment exercise?
Any thoughts on how we're going to grade the essays, give the feedback, give them this assignment, get this back in time to get grades in before second session starts?
I don't know.
It seems like a case where the compression is just going to kill us.
Yeah, it will. So it's a good thing more than ever before that we've got a rubric that we can grade them on. And for the record, you can do this. We can ask them to do this self-assessment exercise based pretty much only on rubric scores, right? The rubric gives them lots of feedback about what we think was strong or weak in their paper. And I always try and give them plenty of narrative feedback too. I don't know if I'll have time to do it this time, but you're right. It's going to break us.
Yeah, that's what worries me is the narrative. I usually give a lot of narrative feedback, and that seems like that would be at least as informative on this as the rubric, and there's just isn't going to be time.
Nope. And the rubric is built into Canvas, so as you're assessing in SpeedGrader, you'll just be able to go over and type click, 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 and then give it a grade based on that. The rubric does not auto-generate a grade. Remember, our rubric gives us ranges, and you get to pick the grade inside that range. But the rubric does give them feedback from the rubric blurbs based on what you click. Any other questions about this assignment? Okay, let's go into the other assignment then. So down at the bottom of the page here is the final projects. Last year, we made the decision to require everybody to do a final project instead of a final exam. So we are all in on final projects. And to be clear, it was an excellent decision that worked out really well. Last year's crop resulted in a really strong set of projects. Oh, am I gonna? There we go. Okay, this is the picture that I took of the display that we had up in the Student Center last year from student artwork. And you can take a look at it at your leisure. I'll try and see if I can get a student to photograph all the individual pieces of artwork. This was the best stuff that we got last year that people passed along to me. And I set it up as a display in the Student Center, and people voted and there was a winner. Carrie asked for examples that she could show her students. This is by way of examples. I'll see what I can do to get you more, but let me go back to the page itself. So Foundations 111 Final Project 2020.doc. Okay, so delete this stuff at the top. The stuff at the top tells you the rules for it. It should be about the theme being human. Projects should require at least 3 texts, more if you want to. Students will produce 2 items, something visual or written, up to them, and a 1,000-word document explaining the ideas behind it. So we're asking them to do a small writing project along with the project itself. Students should be given a few suggestions about what's successful. The projects may be done in groups at your discretion. It's probably a little bit harder to work in groups this year, but if students can pull it off, I find that makes them happier and it makes me happier.
That's great.
On the day of the exam, they'll be given 4 to 5 minutes to present their projects to their peers. This is probably the reason why I'll be doing mine online instead of in person, that it'll make the presentations easier, but it introduces a complication, right? Because the complication is that they have to be able to display what they did online. And they may refer to notes, but not read from a summary. So the example here is Brad's example from a couple of years ago. And the thing that's like very Brad about it is that he really loves the metaphor of a pilgrimage. And so one of the things that he invites students to do is consult an online folder containing a variety of images of medieval pilgrimage maps, and then use that metaphor to talk about our journey in Foundations as a pilgrimage. I don't give my students that one, but if you're interested in doing that, Brad can give you the files for the pilgrimage maps. The second one is the one that I use mostly. Choose some way to visually represent and symbolize the chief ideas you found worthy of exploration, etc. Could be blueprints, could be an abstract work of art, a video, a sculpture, and then in your written statement, you describe in some depth how the ideas you've encountered in these texts have been depicted in your visual representation. The third one is an option for people that don't feel very very visual. Dream up and write some creative text-based artifact that represents and symbolizes the chief ideas you've found worthy of exploration, etc. It could be a short story, a poem, a song, or some other similar items. Then also in your written statement, you'll talk about how the ideas that you've encountered influenced it. Finally, for students who don't feel creative in any way, there's an option. You can write a short article or blog post for public consumption that expresses the relationship between the ideas of the course and our contemporary world. Show how what you've been thinking and learning about the course has some bearing on events, world, etc. In addition to the article, again, you produce a written statement that explains in greater detail. So all of these options, and this is a required element of the project, all of these options require that the students also produce something on the side that talks about the influence of the stuff that we read in class and how all of that is presented in their project. The important thing for me to repeat is that this is not the required format of the project. It is up to you how you assign this project. The required elements are up above, 3 texts. They produce something. They also produce something written. And they give a presentation at the end. But if you've got something that's really brilliant that'll work really well for your class, by all means do that instead of or in addition to the options that that are listed here.
And share it, and share it.
And share it.
This is intimidating for those of us that haven't done it in this format before, and some more examples would be really appreciated.
For my money, 2, 3, and 4 cover the options that I need. That is, do something visual, do something written but creative, do something written and non-creative. I find that that covers most of the sort of settings that I get in students.
May I say something here?
Please.
So I actually jumped the gun. I didn't know that we were going to do this since I did last year. So I already actually gave my assignment to my students because I want them to start thinking on their project.
Great.
And since you asked to share, can I share my screen with you guys quickly?
Yeah.
Just
Yes,
show what
please.
I did. So that I cannot find it. Okay, just a second here. 1 second here. Sorry, I don't know why it's not showing up here. Okay, so. Okay, let's see if it's gonna share now. All right, so can you see here the Word file?
We can see the Zoom.
Only the Zoom screen?
Yeah.
Oh, that's weird. So, okay, so here's what I'm gonna do then, sorry. Okay. Oh man. Okay, let me try again. For some reason that file is not coming up.
So while Guy's looking for that, I want to remind everybody of one thing, and I'll send out an email about it later on. the last piece of end of term business that we have every year is that there is a survey that we ask our students to do about the skill development in the class. The survey is built into everybody's Canvas shell. It should be the very last thing on your Canvas shell. And it's best for student compliance if we give students a couple minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, to do this as part of one of our classes. So please plan to set aside 5 or 10 minutes at the, in the last couple of days of class somewhere to give students to do this. It's a SurveyMonkey survey they can do on their phone. Guy, take it away.
All right, so can you see the Word file here now? So what I basically did was I divided in 4 broad categories of things that they can do. One is reading visual text based on that idea of maps, and because the option was given, the student could select, for instance, an architecture, a building, or a famous painting, or anything that's visual in nature, right? That they did not create it, but they want to do a work based on that piece, like a statue, for instance, right? So then they would be able to work on that one if they want to do something creative, but they don't want to create something creative. The second one here is doing something creative that has something to do that primarily based on writing. A blog, a poem, a song, a chapter of a book, or anything like that, right? That would be centered around writing. The third one here is creative non-writing artifacts, painting, drawing, dancing, performance, right? Or playing a song, or singing, or something like that. So it's still creative, they can do that. And then finally, for my students, what I said, that if they don't want to do anything creative at all, they will be doing a second TDA, like an essay, like another essay. And then what I did, I came up with one question for each one of the readings that we're gonna be covering, we're gonna have covered for this class after TD1. Now, one thing that I would have to add here is that and they all have the same, well, if they do the TDE, they don't have to do the 1,000 words written explanation because the essay covers that. But the others, they wouldn't have. Now, for the reading visual text, if they decided to do a piece of, for instance, on a building, in addition to the 1,000 words, they would have to write a piece about that material that they are using. What's that? Why is that one's relevant or not relevant? What is that piece of visual material that they are using to do their work? So that's what I did here. I divided into categories, and they can choose into those categories. I have 2 students who actually selected in doing the TDE, but all others are doing creative stuff.
Yeah, I like your categories. I like the clarity of it. I think that Brad's descriptions are not as clear as this nearly. I don't love the TDE2 option. And although I'm not gonna, you've already given this out, I'm not gonna say don't do it, but I do wanna caution everybody else not to include this as an option.
Yeah, one word about it, right? So I told them that what they are doing is writing an essay in the same format that the TDE one, right? The TDE that they worked on, but it's not going to be the same level of grading and scrutiny. They're going to have more freedom. They're going to be able to choose, sort of to have more freedom in doing that. But to do this exercise of writing the essay in the format that we asked them to do the TDE one.
So I'm the one that reads every year or 5 years the feedback from students on all of these various things, and one of the things that they always complain about is how different the classes are from one another, and that's why we make the efforts that we do to stay as close to each other in at least all our assignments, if not all of our readings. I think that this is a place on the final project where we've all committed to one vision of it, and the requirements of it ask students to produce, one artifact and then one description of it. So for anyone who has not already deployed this, please don't make write another thesis-driven essay an option for them.
What about group versus individual? Because you mentioned that Brad's version.
Your call.
Was,
yeah,
okay.
I'm not giving my students that.
And I was going to ask you about that. Okay.
Yeah. Other questions, comments, thoughts about the final paper?
I have a question.
Yep.
Can you remind me the rationale for why we have to have 1,000 words to be written up? I just think that's just a lot. I mean, 300 words is a page. Why are we having such, sorry, I'm tired. I've been on Zoom since a long time and I know we all have today, but I look at that 1,000 words, I'm like, especially when we have so much grading to do at the end of the term. So to me, 1,000 words to justify my poem, I just think is intense.
So let me try and channel the thinking of the class here. So this is not me answering for me. This is me trying to answer for.
Yeah, that's what I want, the rationale.
For the rationale. And that is that we want to make sure that the artifact that they do is sufficiently thoughtful and intellectual, and that if we had them write only, I don't know, 100 or 200 words, that they would.
We don't have to decrease it by 90%.
I know.
2 pages.
I think you can be really thoughtful in 500 words. I mean, that's a page and a half. Especially if you're really creative and your creative work that is worthy of being hung in the Student Center is thoughtful and beautiful and time consuming. I don't know why you have to do 1,000 words. I mean, maybe I'm being picky. It just struck me again. I've been doing it and I'll do it again. But I just kind of went, well, why? What are we looking? We're looking for another essay?
Can
I want to be able to cite 3 to 4 sources, because I don't think freshmen are really good at synthesizing and paraphrasing.
They're supposed to bring together at least 3 pieces. And maybe that's a helpful reminder to me. They're supposed to bring together 3 readings that we've read throughout the course of the time and look for some kind of message. Mm-hmm. And that synthesis is, I think, is important, especially because we have the theme of what does it mean to be human, and all of our works are addressing that. Right. So I don't think they have a hard time doing the synthesis for that, because all semester long we're like, where did we hear this before? Where did we hear this before?
Yes.
So that.
Can I ask others to weigh in on this, because I'm not opposed to shortening it, but can we just get some other opinions on this?
Yeah, two pages, 600 words. I have a problem asking students to do a lot of writing that in practice I'm going to end up just completion grading, checking off that they did it if it's too much for me to read. And given the circumstances of this semester, I'd feel better having to write something shorter that I actually read than something longer that I'm just checking off because I don't have time.
Anybody opposed? So what's the right number then? 500, 600? 500, 600. Vote by putting your hands up or down on your screen.
600's 200 words per piece because there are 3 of them, and it's also about 2 pages. So I'd say 6.
Six, 5, 5, 5, 6, 6. 6 it is. All right, 600 words. So 600 words. I'll send out an email in the next little bit about 600 words and reminding everybody about the survey down at the bottom. I think that's especially in this semester probably a good thing and maybe good for everybody. Gwen, question?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that I am correct on something that I was told. I was told that although the semester ends the 28th and 29th, our grades are not due till the 17th. Is that correct? For
17th of what?
October.
I have no idea.
That's what I was told yesterday. So I wanted to make sure on that, because I think that would alleviate some of the stress.
Jeez.
The only problem is for student stress, if things hang over
yes,
far,
I agree.
Then sometimes it's better to have it earlier rather than later so they can just cut the losses and move on.
Well, I'll call the registrar and confirm that one way or another, and I'll put it in the email. Other questions, comments, thoughts before we go? All right, I kept you 10 minutes over, and I made you read an extra paper that we didn't talk about. I'm sorry about that. I hope that the discussion at least gave you a sense of the room, and that's the most important thing for norming, is just for all of us to have an understanding of where everybody is, and we try and come together as much as is practical. All right, guys. Thank you for joining us and for putting in your work today. Carrie Cook confirms grades due October 11th. All right. Bye, guys.
October 11.
Yeah, it's on the master calendar that way. See